Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be a Game Week 6 wildcard draft. I know this is an extremely popular window and a lot of wildcards have been popped active. Part of this, of course, is if you've been carrying, let's say, players like Watkins, players like Rogers, even Wood, for example, maybe even Salah. Seems like a nice little convenient spot to actually shift into what seems to be a stronger template, moving into maybe some more proven midfielders that have proven a lot, like provided a lot of value so far, and then shifting off of, I think, maybe a little bit more of a heavier forward template, and then also saving that spot for Haaland, right? Where you can trust that that value is almost well spent at this moment in time. Or worst case scenario, you start off with the best captain and you work your way forwards with someone like Haaland, given injury, pending anything in the future. Also, it's once again very early in the season, but I think we've already felt the impacts of defensive contributions, and we almost know what are the best picks to go for. But we can also say that clean sheets is still very much real. As I alluded to within some of my videos previously, I think the league average sort of expected goals for an individual team has actually dropped, right? So we're just saying, generally speaking, it seems like quality of the defense in the league is either higher or offense is just worse. And that probably makes it a little bit better for this whole sort of DEFCON template. On top of that, there's also midfielders at the end of the day who are also able to get into the defensive contributions. And I think that that's dramatically shifted the game. I made a joke about this in terms of how Semenyo Cardio versus Newcastle actually out or leveled a Salah captaincy versus Everton, where Liverpool, for example, had the highest expected goals on odds before Game Week 5. So let's just jump into the Game Week 6 wildcard draft. I think what I would like to say is that I think it makes a lot of sense to just build almost the core attack first and then actually think about rounding off with defense, just because for me at this point in time, you're looking at a lot of players who provided good value and you just want to lock them down in place in terms of the attack, and you just want to see what's the compromise when it comes to defense. So if we start with, let's say, the forwards, I almost want to work a little bit backwards today. Haaland and João Pedro, I think, are the most sensible picks, simply because João Pedro just has absolutely nailed minutes, and so does Haaland. Within the context of he's also exhausted, he's playing midweek football. He actually asked Pep to get subbed off versus Arsenal, but I think he'll also get just rested from that EFL Cup game, and Haaland should be good to go again. So from that perspective, of course, you're just working with Haaland and João Pedro. I think you can just lock in Mark Guiu as well. Is it likely that you're going to go triple Chelsea? I think there's a possibility. So if you don't really want to have a 4.3 million forward, I think there's two options, right? Either you're going for a bench boost, which means that you need to stretch and find some money to get Lyle Foster in your team. And I'll talk about how you can do that later on within the video. Or you just go for a 4.4 forward, right? There's plenty of those around. Obi, for example, from United is a good example of that. So those are your options when it comes to, looking at players to round out the offense. But there's a lot of forwards who are interesting, right? If you want to get a bench boost off, I think the likes of Muniz, maybe short-term Richarlison could make sense. But I don't really like any of these picks, just because the point of the wild card in most cases is to reduce the amount of transfers you have possible. If you can get towards a template here where you don't really need a bench boost, or you just want to work with players who won't really need a transfer in the medium to long term, then I think just operating with João Pedro and Haaland alone is good enough. If we move on towards the midfield, I think the biggest news that has changed the landscape of the midfielders is Madueke apparently has a knee scan. He definitely felt something within the match versus Man City, which also caused the halftime sub, also meant that Saka had to play 45 minutes. Now, once again, I don't see Saka playing versus Port Vale. Maybe he does play minutes off the bench again. I can't really see why he would be risked for that match, but that just means his minutes look much better in the future, which actually wants me to put Saka into this wildcard draft. Because if you don't think that you're getting enough value from Salah, which I think is a genuine question worth asking, then you're more than comfortable with captaining Haaland in the near future. It probably also means that if you're wildcarded at this point in time, that you maybe still have your free hit in the back pocket. So I think the game week that really hurts when it comes to captaincy later down the line is going to be that Sunderland at home game. Now, Sunderland have obviously been amazing. And I think you actually have Bruno as a pretty interesting captaincy in Game Week 14, because I think Bruno actually has West Ham at home. At the same time, in Game Week 12, where there's another decent swing, I think Salah himself has that Nottingham Forest at home game, and Nottingham Forest have been a really poor defense so far. We don't expect much to change under Ange. But you've also got Palmer himself, who actually has Burnley away. So those are the considerations, right? I don't really think outside of those two games, Salah and Haaland has any discernible difference where you would be leaning towards a Salah captaincy. So from that perspective, and maybe actually game week 16 is one of them as well. Sorry. Just last one to mention. That's Brighton at home for Salah. And for Haaland, that's a pretty mediocre game. But the pro there is Bruno once again, potentially there, Palmer potentially there, even Saka arguably, potentially around there in game week 16. So I don't think you'd mind so much, right? Wolves at home for Arsenal, just to let you guys know. But that kind of makes me want to actually go off of Salah plus Haaland. I asked the question in terms of Twitter as to whether people want to go Salah and Haaland. I think understandably, with Salah's underlying stats this season and just how Liverpool have played so far, as much as we think that they might be the best offense in the league just on paper, I don't think that they've really shown much of that. And as I said also within my sort of game week review video, looking at my transfer plans, I'm still not seeing that sort of Liverpool of last season where in the second half they just dominated opposing teams, created a lot more shots, created a lot more XG, and Salah took a lot of those chances. So Salah's almost hauls this season, I don't think have come from luck in the sense that if you have a 95-minute player and they get a penalty, like that's kind of what a 95-minute player is supposed to provide you. It's more so in the context of if we're purely relying on that, then that's not good enough at that sort of price point for Salah, especially since outside of, let's say, creating some volume when it comes to assists and those kind of chances, I don't think he's personally getting enough shots off outside of, let's say, that one-off Atleti game. So we have 5 games of data so far where Salah is really, really off the mark, and Haaland is almost on the opposite track where Haaland is close to 6 XG. And this isn't even Salah compared to Haaland. This is, Salah pales in comparison to so many other midfielders in the game right now. He's not at the sort of standards of himself. So I would be tempted to go without Salah in the draft. And to round off the draft, I would go with the picks that have been proven to be really good and solid so far in terms of have they gotten consistent avenues towards points? Have they gotten good minutes so far? Have they actually, played enough games where we think, okay, there's value there? So the picks that I would support Saka with would be Semenyo. Kluivert still seems like he's struggling to actually get into that starting 11. I think that he can easily get in, but even if we were to, let's say, take a scenario where Semenyo was to start, let's say maybe lose penalties for 30 minutes versus 60 minutes, I don't think there's a huge gap, right? So all I'm saying is if Kluivert gets himself into the starting 11 next week, more often than not, he's going to be an early substitution because Bournemouth do actually still have a lot of attacking depth. So Semenyo for me as a nailed-on penalty taker, a nailed-on 95-minute player as well, which means that he can get defensive contributions exactly like he did versus Newcastle. He just seems like a lock for me on this wild card, especially since Palmer, the latest update, I think by Kieran Gills, the journalist on Chelsea, just basically mentioned that Palmer's day-to-day with his injury situation. I just think he's got to have management this season. That's not really an FPL pick that we want to have, especially not at 10.4 million. So Palmer, for me, shouldn't really formulate as part of our plans up until game week 9. So on the game week 6 wildcard, I think Semenyo is just a lock. And you can see him as a bit of a placeholder for Palmer as well, right? Because ultimately, Semenyo is going to have his 2 bad games in game weeks 10 and 11. If you really want to sell Semenyo, you can sell him on game week 9. But it probably also makes sense to actually just keep someone like Semenyo because as soon as game week 12, you've got an amazing game like West Ham at home, and you don't really want to miss on that. So why not just jump on Semenyo and enjoy that for what it is? With Reinders, I think his minutes are undisputably good. We've seen so many different contexts for Man City this season. We've seen so many 90-minute starts. I mean, he hasn't really dropped a single minute within the league. He got subbed off versus Napoli, which I think was a precursor to just this Arsenal match being huge. When they went tank commander mode versus Arsenal, he stayed on the pitch, whereas Foden and Haaland came off. Haaland more so maybe due to exhaustion, but I think Foden definitely just due to the sort of game state. With Reinders, I think that just makes him better for, even some of the easier matches where if he, let's say, potentially gets a rest versus Port Vale, which he really should, just to sort of prioritize, managing the minutes of such a key player, I just think that you're buying someone who is still one of the best picks in the game, especially since you're taking game week 6 into account, right? Burnley at home is so much front-loaded value that it'd be silly to kind of pass up on that. Now, Bruno, for me, is also a lock in the wild card. I think when you look at 6 and 7, Brentford look like an absolutely awful team. So take that game, Sunderland at home, worth it. And if you're going to tell me that Liverpool at away is the detractor from Bruno, I just think you almost have to think, so far this season, has he provided more than enough value for you at this price point? And I think he generally has. If you're not going to go Salah, you have money, spend it. use it on someone like Bruno who has a lot of intangibles. I talked about how Paquetá is like baby Bruno, but I think the big difference at the end of the day with West Ham is that their team attacking strength does look like toilet. And with United, you have to sort of still give them some credit. Obviously, 10 versus 11 allowed Bruno to score versus Chelsea, and that made it a lot easier for him. But it's just a case of, is this team still able to consistently get chances? And is Bruno able to be sort of, the one creating them either from deep or at sometimes, play within attacking 10 positions and get those returns? And I think he still will. So for me, Bruno is a bit of a lock. I think he's a bit of a no-brainer, to be quite honest, on the wild card, especially if you're going to go Salah-less. And as I said, this draft is going to be Salah-less. Outside of Bruno, I think the last pick within the wild card is a little bit debatable within the midfield position, especially since you're going to go cheap within that last forward position. I think you have more than enough money to still go big within the midfield. And I think the big question here is Njai or Kudus. Kudus still looks absolutely fantastic. I know people haven't seen necessarily the goal from him, but does he need to get goals necessarily every single match? No, you're not really purely looking for goals. He's almost changed his profile to someone who's, I think, getting a little bit less shots off compared to when he was at West Ham. So a little bit less XG dominant, but then extremely, extremely key towards the expected assisted goals. And you can clearly see that he's a big part of the set piece delivery for this team. So I just think that there's so much value there from Kudus, and you still have a great game at Wolves at home, that he seems like a very sensible pick. One more thing that I'll mention about Kudus is that he isn't going to AFCON, right? He is one of the few African players who unfortunately haven't qualified. And same with Semenya, right? They're both Ghanaian. So unfortunately, they haven't made it towards this tournament. But if you think long-term, I'm building a wild card and I have to deal with transfers later down the line, he saves you a transfer compared to Njai. Now, the big difference, I think, if we sort of, look forwards is Tottenham will still have some tough games. They'll still have Liverpool. They'll still have Newcastle away. Those are tough matches. Whereas when I look at Njai's schedule, his tough match is actually going to be Chelsea away at Game Week 16. Otherwise, I don't really see a particularly awful game for him. Maybe City away in Game Week 8, right? So that's the comparison in terms of their two bad egg games. I think you can carry either player. I would personally go with Kudus at this moment in time, though. I just think that his minutes are slightly better than Njai's. And even though he doesn't have things like defensive contributions necessarily, I think he's providing enough open play value where he's close. So for me, that's a bit of a 50-50. I can understand going for Njai. I just think that Kudus might even be a hold long term, whereas Njai could be a sell, once again, long term. So that for me is a true 50-50, and that's kind of how I would build the template out. In defense now, since we're looking at how much money we have in the bank, I've worked a little bit away from the amount of money that I have within my own team and tried to create a cheaper defense for everyone. The first thing that I'll mention, as I've mentioned within even my Wildcard 4 video, is if you're going to go cheap on goalkeeper, I think Petrovic is the best 4.5 goalkeeper in the game. If you've watched the cheat sheet series, which once again, plug for that, you'll always know that I've supported that sort of thesis. So for me, I would go with Raya here, who's still 5.5, or go with Petrovic. I don't really like any 5 millions outside of Vicario. I think Vicario is interesting, but I think Petrovic, if you're going to go down from Raya, and you're basically asking for, I think, less clean sheets potentially down the line, I would just go with Petrovic and save yourself that money. And I don't really know how much money everyone has. Some people have made moves, for example, they might have had João Pedro from the beginning and they have all the value from João Pedro. Some people might have done a lot of early transfers. So when I'm suggesting wildcard drafts, keep that in mind, right? But I would go with Raya here because I would assume that people can afford Raya. As I said, though, if you can't afford Raya, just go Petrovic, and maybe that can actually allow you to improve your defense a little bit, because to me, those attacking positions are locked. Now, if you have extra money and you want to get a bench boost off, as I said, Lyle Foster's there. Make use of it because 5 million's okay. Find a game week where he's going to be viable, maybe a 7/8, and then just, be done with the bench boost and have a player who's not going to ruin your team too much in terms of long-term hold up of value within bench. So I would go Dubravka and Raya in goalkeeping positions. At the end of the day, Arsenal have still proven to be one of the absolute best defenses in the league. I think that they positively are. When we look at expected goals allowed, actually Newcastle is top, but I would also say they haven't played Arsenal yet, and Arsenal haven't played Newcastle. So interesting to see what will happen after that game, but clearly the base for both of these teams is extremely rock solid this year. I just don't really like the Newcastle fixtures, if I can say so myself, and I think that they've still got some pretty tough games to come, like, for example, this Arsenal match, as I said, and, some tests like, for example, Man City or Brighton away, etc. Will be interesting to see how Newcastle get challenged. Now, obviously, they've already done it versus Liverpool, so there's not much to be said there. But yeah, that's almost how I would take it going forwards. I would go with Raya, and I'd consider maybe Pope, but yeah. I still like Petrovic very, very much if you're just going to spend, as I said, the 4.5 and you'd rather save some money and not go for Raya. In defense, though, I would go Gabriel. I think he brings just that nailed value within the Arsenal defense. I still think he provides overall, better attacking contributions compared to Saliba. We've seen that year on year on year. I don't think there's too much of a need to really explain that. And I think a big pro with Gabriel this season is we've actually seen that he actually averages more defensive contributions than Saliba. So if there's ever going to be games where he can get defensive contributions, like he was able to get them in game week 4, then I think that's more likely for Gabriel than it is for Saliba. So I would choose him. There's other Arsenal defenders that are cheaper, right? Timber, Calafiori have played a lot of minutes so far, but you can see that White is still around the periphery. He's not fit, I think, fully yet. With Calafiori, I guess the question marks are going to be, what is Hincapié going to do? We haven't seen much of Lewis Skelly in the midfield, so for me, their minutes are also not great in terms of this new game structure where you want defensive contributions in some various circumstances, although I totally recognize that they were able to get, 18, 20 points within one match versus Leeds. But yeah, I think your best bet is still going to be Gabriel if you want to dip into that double Arsenal defense. And I think there's a lot of value here going to Arsenal when they're about to embark on post-game week 6, a great run of games. Senesi for me is a lock as well. He's about to go up in price tonight. He's just proven himself to be the best DEFCONer in the game. And Bournemouth have also proven themselves to be the best DEFCON creating team within the game. So those two, I think, are the most interesting. And then I would say Anderson is a bit of a lock because he's also proven himself to be extremely solid. Not only is he potentially playable this week because Aston Villa look absolutely awful and look like one of the worst offenses in the league. That's not even just because they haven't scored goals. That's simply because they haven't created chances. When you look at the expected goals for Aston Villa, it's pretty abhorrent. And I can't see why too much would change. This is the full strength team. Other than maybe, let's say, benching Buendia and starting Elliott, I don't think there's much better that we can necessarily expect from this Aston Villa team with players like Tielemans out, for example. So that's Aston Villa for you. Anderson plays for a really top defense. They haven't gotten all the clean sheets that we want necessarily, but that's kind of why you have Senesi. And then Anderson for me is also someone who's just really, really, really solid for defense contributions. And you don't necessarily want to go double Bournemouth because you want rotation. So I think later down the line, for example, when let's say Bournemouth have bad fixtures in game weeks 10 and 11, that's when Anderson comes in. Anderson has Wolves at home. He has Everton away. He's got Son at home after that as well. So some really good fixtures down the line for Anderson. I would still see that Anderson is the best 4.5 in the game, maybe long term, but also that's because Senesi has no longer become a 4.5. He's a 4.7 now. So those are picks for me that are locked. The 4.0 that I actually like the most now, even though I've been sort of on that Esteve bandwagon myself, is actually going to be Alderete from Sunderland. Now, when you look at the 4.0 landscape, I think what's worth considering. First of all, Goodmanson's interesting, Rodon's interesting, Mukiele, Alderete, Reynaldo, Esteve. These are all the picks I think on paper that are quite interesting, maybe Hartman as well. But I think you just want defensive contributors. Goodmanson, I think, is a bit different because he actually creates a fair few chances where that kind of shifts things. But with Reynaldo, I think he's actually going to serve his suspension within the cup anyways. But Reynaldo's actually going to go towards, I think he's going towards AFCON. So that means he's going to be a future transfer out. You don't want to be wasting a transfer on a 4.2 in the future. You want that 4.0 to be playable at any point in time. So I think Alderete is the best pick because his defensive contribution baselines are actually really, really solid. And I think Sunderland have actually already so far shown up to be potentially the best promoted defense. I easily have to just sort of swallow my words when it comes to these teams. I think they've all been quite impressive. Even Burnley, towards the extent that they're not as bad as, let's say, a Southampton versus or Leicester last season, already makes them impressive in my books. But yeah, if we're talking really what the best defense is, I think I'd back Sunderland. I think for nailedness going forwards, I think Alderete is perfect. Yeah, and he's even got a little bit of chance creation there as well himself. So I would go with him. He's not going to be an AFCON transfer, and that's pretty much why I'd pick him as my 4.0. So yeah, up the Paraguayan there. As far as the last pick here, I think it's once again similar to that Njai and Kudos position where it's optional. I think that I would chance Guardiola, but I can understand when you look at the fixtures in Game Week 6 and you think about starting with the defender who is a great fixture from this point onwards, why you'd want to go with Tarkowski as well. I think they're both close. I think going for Guardiola is basically saying, when you look at this Man City system, who is actually the most interesting defender to go for and who's the most nailed and who can play the most different tactical setups that Pep can sort of employ. We've seen Guardiola played all across the field before. We have also seen him get rested, and I think he's coming back from an injury, which is key. But that probably also means that he's going to serve his rest versus Port Vale, as opposed to, playing consistent minutes there. He's played midweek football before. He's met the demands, and I think Guardiola could serve you really, really well, especially if you think long-term where, sure, City have a pretty tough run of games between 10 and 12. But actually, if you look, for example, long view, if you can keep a City pick like Guardiola long term, 15 to like 19 is just a mad run of games. You even get Sunderland twice. So yeah, if you want to pick a super long-term pick, and I think you really trust Guardiola's minutes, I would go Guardiola now. If you don't really subscribe to that, then just go Tarkowski. Tarkowski is such a simple pick to get. I would pick him still over Virgil. Virgil right now is 6.1. I wildcarded into Virgil partially because of a game like Burnley away. Some of those good games are gone now, right? Even the Everton game on paper was a good game for, reducing expected clean sheets, or improving expected clean sheets. And that's kind of off the slate. So if I was to sort of look at game week 6 onwards, I'd probably pick Tarkowski, save myself 0.6 million. And it then becomes a question of, it depends on how rich you are, I guess, as an FPL manager. What else can you do to upgrade your team? I think saving money in the bank is quite helpful, right? Because more money in the bank means you can consider things like, a flexible move towards Palmer later down the line if he's ever going to be fit. It seems like, as I said, he's day to day, so you don't really need to put him into your short-term considerations. Neither do I think his minutes are like that good where you have to sort of scramble your team for him. But you can even make an upgrade, like maybe moving a 4.0 towards Richards if you really want to. But I also think that Chris Richards isn't that good, right? Sure, Chris Richards had an absolutely amazing DEFCON game versus West Ham, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he's much, much better than someone like Alderete. I still think a 4.0 could actually be really good value. And that's particularly because I think once again, another good week of Sunderland defensive football on, I feel much more confident in them as a team compared to, let's say, when I did a game week 4 wildcard and I wasn't so sure about the 3 game week sample size of Sunderland. They've just proven to be really, really solid. And I was really impressed by the 10 versus 11 defensive performance, or maybe unimpressed with Aston Villa, right? If we want to put it like that. So that's pretty much what I would say. I think this wildcard template structure feels really solid, especially with the Noni Madueke news, unfortunately. And the scope to improve, as I said, is going to be if you want to go for things like Guardiola, if you want to maybe even get a 8th, let's say, forward, potentially, someone like in that Foster spot, just to even get a bench boost off, or potentially just, to make sure your team's a little bit more insulated. But saving money in the bank on a wild card is totally fine. If you want to go Gu, if you want to go Obi, and then just have a lot of money in the bank, I think this is the best way to go. So this is how I would set the wild card team up. In terms of how this team would actually line up this week, I think it's quite simple. You play Raya, you bench Dubravka. In defense, you would line up with Senesi, with Guardiola / Tarkowski, and of course, you would play Gabriel. Now, I think Gabriel and Anderson's quite close, but it's really a case of, top defense versus, I guess, like, top-ish defense with Anderson versus another team that have actually, like, if we can be honest, like, Newcastle have not been impressive whatsoever from the attacking point of view. Neither have Aston Villa, right? So it's a similar type of game. I'd probably pick Gabriel because I tend to like playing double defense over one defense in terms of, I think if you're playing FPL and you're going to play, let's say, a double defense every single week, you're probably going to net more value just in theory because you're backing for the same outcome as opposed to trying to back split outcomes. So I would go with Ryan Gabriel in a situation like this, and I would put Alderete on the bench. You've got a really strong auto sub sort of lineup, especially with these sort of DEFCON type center backs. I think you just enjoy that. And of course, Alderete could be center back, left back, but that's kind of how I would line up. 3 at the back. In the midfield, I would just play all the midfielders: Bruno, Saka, Reinders, Kudus, Semenyo. Saka seems like he's going to get minutes versus Newcastle. I think it's worth playing him over even the likes of Anderson. And then Haaland, João Pedro, super simple, super easy plays. You got Brighton at home for João Pedro, Burnley at home for Haaland. The only con, I suppose, towards the wild card really is that you can't triple captain Haaland versus Burnley. You can create whatever narratives you want. Haaland still has amazing fixtures later down the line. He's got Sunderland at home, even though, as I said, Sunderland look like a really good defense. I probably would be actually still angling West Ham. But of course, if they bring Nuno in, people will say Haaland can't score versus Nuno, which is, I think, honestly, a bit of a nonsense as well, to be fair, because at the end of the day, when we looked at the end of last season, that Nuno defense was not particularly good when it comes to underlying numbers. So I would still back a future Haaland triple captaincy. You could obviously still even go towards a Salah one later down the line. Who knows? You've got a triple captain very, very long. So that's kind of how I would angle it. And that's pretty much it for the wildcard draft. I hope you guys have a wonderful week. Best of luck with wildcarding. I think it's a really nice window towards wildcarding. I think one of the, the positives of wildcarding now is you ultimately don't have to force any moves in the short term, right? Would you be that concerned about Salah and moving into Salah in game week 8? Not really. Would you be that concerned about Palmer in the short term up until maybe game week 9 when he actually has his next best game? Not really, right? And you even get the chance to jump onto someone like Saka ahead of his West Ham game at home, and that's a huge plus. So it doesn't feel like from a template or structure point of view that you need to take into account certain players or certain things. Like, for example, when I did a game week 4 wildcard, I think one thing that I was very much in mindful of is that I needed to have plans for Haaland in game week 6. So, for example, I myself have gone 2 free transfers to Haaland, but here you're on a wildcard where I don't think there's any sort of moves in the future that are locked in, right? It just really comes down to, can Salah sort of uptick in form, and maybe do you consider him later down the line? Can Palmer even sort of stay fit, and maybe you then consider him down the line? That gives you a lot of, I think, comfort when it comes to creating a wildcard draft in game week 6. So that's where we've landed on it. So thank you guys for watching. See you guys soon. Take care and goodbye.